Hello and welcome to this fifth edition of Let's Talk Competition. My name's Nicholas Hirst. I'm the Chief Correspondent at MLex for EU Competition Policy here in Brussels. And I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. What we're talking about today are the EU state aid rules and the impact on these rules of the revival of industrial policy in recent years. Why has there been a revival? Well, you need look no further than the climate crisis, the rise of geopolitics, the rise of China, the sense of economic decline. Enter industrial policy, which seeks to give the state a bigger role in generating growth and leading investments. But does a muscular industrial policy sit awkwardly with the EU's strict state aid rules, which are meant to control the role of the state in the economy and in particular state handouts? Well, that's the subject of today's discussion. I'm joined on my left by Ben Smulders, who's the Deputy Director General responsible for state aid at the European Commission in DG Competition. Next to Ben is Stéphanie Yon-Courtin, who's a member of the European Parliament, sits on the Committee for Economic Affairs, and is none less than that committee's rapporteur on competition policy. And next to Stéphanie is Adina Claici, who's Managing Director at the Berkeley Research Group, an economic consultancy, and also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. As regards the format for today's discussion will be divided into three blocks. First, we're going to explore Europe's evolving stance on globalization and climate change, and why there's been a revival of industrial policy in recent years. Second, we're going to ask what this means for principles that have long been dear to EU policymakers: the single market, the level playing field, the primacy of the competition rules, and in particular, the state aid rules. And third, we're then going to look forward and ask, what's the future of state aid? Will it survive this global race to develop new technologies and combat climate change? After we've done that, I'm going to be putting your questions to the panel. If you'd like to ask a question, then you can do so by using Slido. You can do that, you can find the QR code for Slido by going onto the website of DG Competition, or by scanning the QR code that's at the bottom of this screen at the moment. Alternatively, you can go to the Slido website and you can participate by putting in the hashtag Let's Talk Competition. And of course, I really encourage you to engage with the debates also on social media, whether it's X, formerly Twitter, or LinkedIn. And there the hashtag to use is, again, Let's Talk Competition. So let's talk competition. Ben, if I can start with you, it's 2024. What are the EU's industrial priorities and goals?
Well, I think that's very clear. The economic and industrial policies priorities of the EU are first and foremost to enable the green and digital transitions to happen. And that has been the top priorities of the Commission from the very beginning of the mandate. And that means promoting the innovative technologies that we need to build a net zero economy by 2050. And by doing this, we not only build a sustainable society, but we also promote the kind of innovative industries for which Europe is known and which can provide jobs and stability in the future. But there are also other priorities which are very much on our minds today. The COVID crisis and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine have shown how exposed we are to factors beyond our control, and how quickly and strongly events can impact on our economy and indeed on our daily lives. So we need to make sure that our economy is robust. We need to reduce our reliance on outside factors in strategic areas, and we need to drive down the risks in our economic system. This is what is sometimes referred to as open strategic autonomy. In simpler words, it is about making us stronger in a troubled world and make sure we can continue to make our own choices about the kind of Europe that we want to live in. This is, in short, about making the EU more resilient in a world of increasing geopolitical instability. And I think this is entirely consistent with the fundamental priorities of the twin transitions. A stronger economy built on carbon-free energy makes the EU stronger altogether.
Okay, so the overarching policy is one of open strategic autonomy. Perhaps you could give us an example of how the Commission has translated that into EU state aid policy.
I think that some people may have the impression that the Commission has made great changes to state aid control in a hurry to address the issues that make the headlines. And I want those who watch this to understand that this is really not the case. In fact, over the last 5 years, we have made across-the-board review of the state aid rulebook and updated it in order to make sure the rules support the twin transition by channeling public funding towards the green and digital investments that the markets will not provide because they are too risky or too costly. So this is in fact something we have been doing all through the mandate. And last year, we also saw a need to create space for state aid investments to manufacture certain categories of strategic products in sectors that are key for the green transition. And in some specific situations, if there is a clear risk that such investments may be attracted outside Europe, we allow state aid to match the subsidies that may be offered outside the EU. In fact, this was done a few weeks ago when the Commission approved aid for Northvolt, a factory in Germany, that will be able to produce batteries for up to 1 million electrical cars by 2029.
That's right. I think that was the first time that the Commission has approved some matching aid, and the danger there was that Northvolt, the big hope in Europe for electric batteries, was going to move to the US. Stéphanie, I've heard you say that when you first came to Brussels, or rather when you joined the European Parliament in 2019, industrial policy was a gros mot, it's a swear word. That's changed, I think. Can you explain a little bit why it's changed and where we are now?
Yeah, well, indeed, in 2019, both actually industrial policy and EU champions were swear words, really. I think the entire world has changed. We have been through several crises that we have never experienced since the EU exists. First, a global pandemic that required a massive support for people and companies. Second, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia that led to an energy crisis with a massive rise of prices for both households and companies. And these have put jobs at risk, but also the competitiveness of our European companies and of the European economy as a whole. And it was like, I think, a wake-up call for everybody, as we definitely realized how dependent the European Union is to third countries. At the same time, some of our major partners, such as the US, have put 350 billion euros on the table to boost their domestic production. So yes, words such as industrial policy, resilient, strategic autonomy, and European sovereignty are no longer a taboo. And I think this is a good signal. I think we need to stop beating ourselves up. We set ourselves some ambitious European objectives. We have policy tools, and our competition policy, including state aid, is, I think, one of them. And I think it is up to us to ensure we can achieve our goals as Europeans. And that does not mean that European industrial policy should rely exclusively on public support. I think it means that the European Union should use all its toolbox to achieve its objectives, but that must be done at EU level and not national level. And that requires holistic vision somehow, encompassing all our policies such as green, digital transition, competition policy, and also trade policy. The EU internal market is our biggest asset. And so we need to have European players being able to compete globally and master these twin transitions to the benefit of consumer and companies. And I would add to the twin transition defense as well. So many key transitions are ahead.
All at the same time.
At the same time.
As well. Of course, you mentioned the impact on jobs. You mentioned COVID, energy prices. These are all things that affect millions of people across Europe in their everyday lives, and are of course very important also for the ballot box, things that people really vote about. But that's a political perspective of how we got here. Adina, perhaps you have experience advising companies on questions of state aid. What do you think is the corporate perspective on globalization and industrial policy? What do you think companies feel like they need to be able to become European champions or lead the world in some of these critical technologies?
So as far as I have seen, companies welcome the industrial policy, the development in industrial policy in Europe. They see opportunities of investing in Europe thanks to these new objectives. However, there is some work to do as an economist, as an advisor. Sometimes I need to help them understand why there is need for a state aid scrutiny on top of this, because especially non-European companies, they don't fully understand why, on the one hand, Europe is opening up, adding the justifications for providing support, and on the other hand, there is this, as they might see it, tough scrutiny from the state aid part. As an economist and as an advisor, I think I can help them understand why there is need for this, because the money must come from somewhere, and it comes from the European taxpayers. So they should understand that even if there is political willingness to go in the direction of supporting, let's say, a certain industry, there must be some limitations on the funds that these companies receive. So once they understand this, they can help the Commission in understanding their own case, so that the Commission then clears this support from the part of the member state. What they ask as well is, okay, maybe this is a good justification, but we would need these rules to be clear. We would need, if possible, the rules to be simpler. For example, the temporary frameworks, the various temporary frameworks are a good example of the way the Commission used the flexibility of the rules and implemented very quick ways to support companies. Another issue that I've encountered sometimes, which I may put forward as a simplification, is the fact that in this in providing state aid, we not only have the Commission and the beneficiaries, we also have the member state, because the money comes from the member state. So we have three parties at the table, but very often the dialogue is bilateral between the beneficiaries and the member states, and then between the member states and the Commission. So the member states are often messengers, and maybe they are not always best placed to represent the businesses there, to explain the businesses in front of the Commission, and also the other way around. So I think it would be useful more often to have these trilateral meetings, Commission, member states, beneficiaries, companies, because even if incentives, of course incentives are different, but there is a common goal to get the support for the benefit of the three parties. So putting the cards on the table by all the parties may help transparency, and in my view may speed up the processes and may accelerate this support to reach the companies for the benefit of everyone. So that would be a proposal to simplify the process, to help this move forward faster.
You can well imagine the place to explain what the competitive dynamics and the investment needs are in a particular sector. You mentioned the temporary frameworks. Of course, those were a set of rules or guardrails that the Commission came out with in response to the COVID crisis and the energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. And these set out, this explained to member states and companies how aid support could be dispersed in a rapid function, so long as it met certain criteria. And it was a sort of emergency response to a burning emergency. I'd just like to pick up on what Adina said about funds should be limited to really what's necessary, state aid, subsidies. Ben, is this still really the case in 2024? There are people out there that say that in the face of these emergencies, state aid control has been watered down in the last couple of years.
No. I think state aid control has not been watered down. In fact, the state aid rulebook has shown it has both strength and vitality, because it has this inbuilt flexibility to let us change gear when a great crisis hits us. We did so in the financial crisis 2008. We did it again with COVID-19 and the energy crisis created by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. This flexibility was built into the European treaties from the very beginning. So it is not a case of watering down the rules, but of knowing when and under which conditions to break the glass in case of emergency. And this is why the flexibility that has been added to the rules in the last few years has always been temporary, so that it is phased out when the situation improves. That is what we will be doing now as well with the temporary crisis and transition framework, because it's very important to know where to draw the line. Otherwise, we take risks with the single market, which in the long term is the best tool to keep Europe competitive and resilient. And although we should always encourage sound European industries, we should certainly not subsidize undertakings at any cost. We should only, and you said it also, only have subsidies where it is necessary to provide critical investments that the markets are not providing for some reason. And even then, we need to make sure that the aid is limited to what is strictly necessary and that all firms get a fair chance. Those have always been, and still remain, the core principles of state aid control. In fact, state aid control can be boiled down to those simple principles. It has to be necessary and proportionate. Then it makes our economy more effective. If not, it wastes money and crowds out better ideas that can be privately funded.
Very good. So in 2024, necessity, proportionality, the level playing field are still very much at the centre of state aid policy. Stephanie, do you think that the European Commission is perhaps too cautious in that regard, given the poly-crisis that we face these days? Should it be moving faster? Can the level playing field survive this race to lead strategic industries and technologies?
Well, I think the European Commission is definitely in its role when it comes to ensure fair conditions in the internal market. The European Commission allows member states to provide support when it's necessary with, as Ben mentioned already, a targeted and temporary approach, and it definitely has to be balanced. Balanced approach. The temporary frameworks in response to COVID crisis and energy crisis showed how rapidly also the European Commission react, and the temporary crisis and transition framework was definitely needed to make it simpler for member states to provide support to strategic sectors for the green transition. And as Ben already mentioned, I think the recent approach of the European Commission with the decision on Northvolt illustrates quite a change of paradigm. So you have the regulation, you have the frameworks, but you also have now concrete decision. And thanks to this matching clause, this introduced after the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Commission was and is able to allow Germany to match the aid that Northvolt would have received in the US. So that means that the production of batteries for electric vehicles will remain in Europe, and I think it's a good signal when it comes to not protectionism, but a less naive approach. And this is a good news for European strategic, I think, autonomy. We're not giving up in the name of naive principle that would prevent us from competing with measures from third countries that boost domestic production, because state aid is all about domestic production as well, boosting domestic production. However, if we want a level playing field, to ensure that not only the member state with fiscal capacity can support their companies, we need to invest as Europeans. And in that sense, I'm really sorry to see the really small step taken from the European Commission concerning the development of strategic technologies and industries in Europe. The US put, as I said already, 350 billion euros on the table, and the EU response was only an extra 10 billion euros to the budget. So the scope is, I think, by far too restricted. The funding is not ambitious at all, and that does not send the right signal, I think, to address the risk of fragmentation of the single market, because there is a real risk of fragmentation. And I guess that maybe we will have the occasion to come back on the future on the state aid policy on this matter. But I think it's very, very critical.
Thank you. I like the pun. You said that this was a small step from the Commission, but a step is obviously a step, but it's also a reference to the proposal that was tabled by the Commission in June, and it stands for a Strategic Technologies for Europe platform. And that reallocated various funds in the EU budget and added only an extra 10 billion to the pot in total. So, Stéphanie, you think there's a lack of funding? We've perhaps left behind some of the naive principles, but all of this may limit Europe's ability to achieve strategic autonomy. Of course, on the other side, there are concerns that Europe risks getting into a subsidies race where no one benefits other than the investors in companies and their shareholders, or certain companies and certain shareholders. This fear of throwing good money after bad. Adina, is it possible for politicians and regulators to really tell good subsidies from bad subsidies? Is it possible to put a value the benefit of having certain companies in Europe?
I think it is. Conceptually, it's pretty straightforward. I'll give you an example. Then it may take a bit of effort to quantify, but economists have the right tools to quantify this. Of course, this is not going to be possible to be quantified up to a decimal point, but I will give you an example of how we could find an order of magnitude an order of magnitude of the value that Europe might put on these subsidies. So let's take, we've talked already about security of supply. Security of supply is one of the justifications for industrial policy, very good justification. The past has shown that global crises, such as the COVID crisis, such as political tensions in parts of the world, such as even natural disasters, had a huge impact on industries. In particularly, the COVID pandemic, together with some geopolitical tensions, hit severely the European automotive industry. There are studies showing that the losses that Europe and the industry, the automotive industry, suffered in that period due to these unexpected shocks amount to up to for failure to deliver 4 million vehicles and losses to industries up to 50 billion euros. So if we enhance the security of supply in Europe, we can avoid paying that cost. And this is a clear quantification. There is a vast economic and empirical literature quantifying the effects of unexpected shocks on the economy. And then we have this literature gives us good tools to find orders of magnitude of the costs that would be paid in cases of such crisis, and implicitly of what we could save if we put in place measures that ensure security of supply in Europe. So once we have this value, an order of magnitude of this value, then a very simple cost-benefit analysis, putting this value against the cost, which is the subsidy, may lead to a right decision of whether it is worth giving these subsidies to this industry. Are we going to get value for money, in other words, from our subsidies? So I think we can make steps. It's not totally arbitrary, the amount and the order of magnitude of the subsidies that Europe should give to industries in order to achieve these objectives.
So it's an exercise of predicting the unexpected.
Estimating.
Yeah, but what we do know is going to happen is there are European Parliament elections happening in a few months' time. Stéphanie, you're going to be running. I think we can say with more or less certainty that this whole debate about industrial policy and strategic autonomy is going to only intensify in the next political mandate. A new commission should be in place by the autumn. Stéphanie, what kind of industrial policy do you think is going to be necessary in the new mandate? And what are the lessons that you draw for the future from the US's adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act, the $350 billion plan that you mentioned earlier?
Well, I really would like to see Europe as a real power. I'd like the EU to be an industrial leader that exports European products and technologies. I'd like to see the concrete European strategic autonomy while remaining a pioneer for the green and digital transition. And let me mention also defense, because I think this is a major issue. So concretely, and following your question, the Inflation Reduction Act underlined the need for the EU to invest in the green transition, and to do so we should do, I think, more investments as Europeans to invest for economic growth. And neither state aid policy nor STEP, I think, nor the review of the fiscal rules will allow the massive investments needed for sovereignty in Europe. We definitely need to have a European fiscal capacity to invest as Europeans and avoid any subsidy race or fragmentation which is inevitable in the internal market. And the recent events have also shown that the European Union should be, I think, less naive in ensuring a level playing field with industries from third countries. This is what we have done with the foreign subsidies regulation and with the matching clause altogether. And I think we should continue this way with no shame. And last but not least, the European industrial policy cannot be a new silo. You know, once it has been recognized as, being properly articulated with competition or trade and so on, it cannot be a new silo added next to other policies. That should be an objective which requires the interplay of all our policies. And in order to achieve it, we also need the adequate resources. I'm looking at Ben, we discussed this a lot, to enforce our new regulation tools. I hope we will have good surprises in the next few days or weeks, because that holistic view means mobilizing private and public investment, including state aid, while taking into account our own European objectives. And for instance, with the NZIA, the Net Zero Industry Act, we acknowledged that we have the most ambitious environmental and social standards. However, we definitely need to make sure it does not work against us, against our European companies. You know, virtuous companies that invest in the green transition should be favored in public procurement tenders, as opposed to companies that use forced labor, for example, to cut costs. So I think this is one way forward that could be applied to all sectors. A power, real power.
Understood. So vast investments, perhaps through shared borrowing at the EU level, proper resources to make sure that the rules are not only enforced, but actually decisions happen quickly to enable these things to take place. And in particular, joined up policies, so that industrial policy is not one among various objectives, but it's actually the overarching or informing the different policy frameworks. Ben, the CHIPS Act flagged the possibility or explained the possibility of how state aid could be given for investments in things called mega fabs, which I think are these giant microchip factories. IPCEIs, which are pan-European investment projects, which are approved by the European Commission under state aid rules, have been approved in sectors such as batteries, cloud computing, microelectronics. Looking ahead, what sectors do you think could be up next to receive or what sectors are important for Europe's strategic goals in the coming years?
Well, let me start with dispelling a misunderstanding. I don't think it's for the Commission to sit and pick winners. Open competition on fair and even terms does that. That's the European way, and it will remain so. It's also why, for instance, our state aid rules encourage member states to hold open tenders to let green technologies compete on result and on cost, to make sure that we spend our money on the best and cheapest technologies. That being said, the Commission has identified a range of sectors which are critical for the green transition and which are also liable to attract outside the EU. Apart from batteries, this includes, amongst others, solar panels, wind turbines, our heat pumps for production and recycling or related critical raw materials. But what is important is that we base our policy on actual evidence that aid is needed. So we will keep monitoring this.
Obviously, there are IPCEIs that have already been approved, and the CHIPS Act is in place. Are these being looked at as examples to guide future IPCEIs or to design future new frameworks for state aid review?
Very much so. I think a lot can be, many lessons can be drawn from these IPCEIs. As you know, they involve vast amounts of money, but they are not just granted, authorized on very easily. And a set of very important criteria must be met. They must address a demonstrated market failure. It can only be given if absent the aid, the project would not take place, or only in a manner which would be significantly less beneficial. It must also be proportional. The aid can only cover the funding gap, meaning that it compensates for lack of profitability inherent in a market failure. And it must, and this is also very interesting from the IPCEIs, it must provide safeguards against the fragmentation in the internal market by ensuring that on top of this cross-border nature of the project, there are significant spillover by, for instance, sharing the innovative findings across the European industry.
So it's the same principles of necessity, proportionality applied to a new, broader type of scheme.
Absolutely.
So, Adina, we were talking earlier about whether how the Commission had adapted state aid policy in to the polycrisis of today. I'd be curious to know what you think. Has the Commission softened? And sorry, Ben, I should say, made the case very strongly that the rules haven't been watered down. What's your opinion? Do you think there's been a softening of enforcement of the state aid rules? And how confident are you that in the future the EU state aid control will survive this ever-growing debate about industrial policy?
I'm afraid I will have to agree with Ben to a large extent because I don't believe state aid rules have been softened. The Article 107 of the EU Treaty that governs the state aid rules gives a lot of flexibility for the objectives that state aid can cover. So I think the developments in industrial policy recently in Europe only added to those objectives because of the geopolitical developments, the global geopolitical developments. So I think these are justified additions to the objectives of state aid. And then I also agree with you that industrial policy should be the umbrella, whereas state aid provides the tools to assess. So to assess the individual cases of support. Because, as I said in my introductory remarks, subsidies cannot be unlimited because there is this trade-off between taxpayers and industry. So the more you give to industries, the more you have to take from the taxpayers. And that's why I believe that state aid and industrial policy are complementary in the sense that industrial policy identifies a political ambition, a good objective. In the state aid jargon, we talk about objective, that markets alone could not deliver. It has been mentioned before. There is a market failure to deliver to the extent needed, the certain objective. So if we all agree on this, then the direction towards subsidy, towards supporting these industries is non-controversial. So industrial policy provides the direction, whereas state aid comes in with the assessment of every case to provide the magnitude, to give some indications of how much of this support is justified and is sufficient to achieve this objective. So I think they are complementary policies. One gives a direction and the other one helps in quantifying. State aid policy helps in quantifying the magnitude of this.
That was very clear. Industrial policy provides the overall direction. State aid policy is what comes in to assess the magnitude. And when discussing these ideas that can sometimes be theoretical or a little abstract, it's true that ultimately what's at play is money raised from ordinary taxpayers through their salaries and spending. So now it's over to the audience. If you're watching at home, if you're watching at home or actually more probably in the office, you're able to ask questions via Slido. You can find the QR code for Slido on the website of DG Competition or in fact at the bottom of the screen at the moment. If you go onto the website of Slido, you can participate by using the hashtag Let's Talk Competition. Just type your question and press Ask. So now let's take the first question from Slido. This is a question, I think, Stéphanie, I'll come to you first. The question is, and it's from Vincent Guerre from CIA Europe. Massive state aid inevitably fragments the EU internal market. To avoid that, would it make more sense to grant stronger support directly from the EU budget?
Yeah, well, thank you, Vincent. That's something I do share your question point of view, and of course, what I said is that of course all this massive state aid will lead to fragmentation of the market, and of course we can call for stronger support on the EU budget. But I do regret that, as I've always said, that we've seen only a small step in this budget because the Commission put on the table only an extra 10 billion euros versus, the big response of the US. So I guess EU budget will not be sufficient either, and that's why I think we definitely need to have a European fiscal capacity to invest as Europeans, and that's where this leads us to, the consolidation of the market capitals unions as well. I mean, this will be also a very big priority for the next mandate, I'm sure, which is the nerf de la guerre. But of course, yes, EU budget and European fiscal capacity to invest publicly and privately. Yeah, of course.
Ben, what do you think?
Yes, no, I just wanted to make a general remark, because I would like to avoid that everything, all the industrial economic problems which we have, which are very urgent at the moment, can be resolved only through state aid. I think that's definitely wrong. Also, take for instance our Green Deal industrial plan, which we adopted last year. There, it had different pillars. It acknowledged that we had to focus on skills. We needed a more predictable and framework, regulatory framework, more simplified. It put also emphasis on the need for trade and funding. But it was only one among 4 or 5 means to achieve an industrial policy objectives, which were clearly in that context aimed at the Green Deal transition. So, and then as regards funding, you need to make a distinction between private funding and public funding. Private funding is something you can enhance by, for instance, deepening the capital markets in the European Union and deepening the banking union. Funding, there you need to make a distinction between also, as regards public funding, between EU funding and national funding. I'm also very much, and the Commission is also very much in favor of EU funding, be it that it is one way to address the problem of the difference between the depth of the pockets of the member states, which has, of course, an effect on the level playing field within the European Union. But the main message I would like to convey is that there is a variety of means which are necessary, which can be used and should be used in order to achieve certain industrial policy objectives, and already choosing the right tool is an important first question to be addressed. That doesn't necessarily lead to the question more funding and more public funding. And once the answer is indeed funding is necessary, there are questions about the design of the tool of the funding, and there, of course, state aid policy comes in. But it's of course all part of a much wider approach to achieve these 3-4 main objectives of our industrial policy at the moment.
Right. So funding is not necessarily a silver bullet in all instances, nor is tampering with the state aid rules. Adina, what do you think about this idea of putting funds in the EU budget? Does that resolve the competition concerns that one would typically have with Berlin backing a particular company or France investing in a sector?
I think it does not completely, because I have 2 points I wanted to add here. First of all, I mean, investments have to be located in a certain place. And once you locate the investment in a certain place, there are spillovers. Obviously, there is a requirement that these spillovers should be to the wider EU, but it's more obvious that you have spillovers closer by to the investment. So eventually, there will be more gains for the country that hosts that investment. Now, on the other hand, we shouldn't forget about the EU regional state aid policy. We also have regional aid to compensate for disparities between different member states. For example, we were talking about batteries. I remember very recently Samsung was given aid by Hungary to set up a plant of batteries in Hungary, and this was not set up in Germany or in other more developed EU countries. So I think this is a good example also of how to help member states that are lagging behind, let's say in Europe, to welcome their investments in their own places.
State aid, or in particular coming from the European budget, can be used to maybe iron out some of the disparities in the single market. But that certainly those certainly are controversial decisions when picking who stands to benefit and who doesn't. So we have more questions on the Slido. Ben, perhaps I could come to you with this one. The inbuilt flexibility of state aid rules is ideal for crisis situations. But how do we concretely delineate, so how do we distinguish between what's temporary and permanent in industrial policy?
I think the answer is relatively easy, by very closely monitoring market developments. And it was that approach which prompted us, for instance, during the COVID crisis, to adapt the rules relatively frequently, because the situation on the ground in the markets changed quite rapidly. We didn't want, if you are really serious about necessity and proportionality and addressing market failures, then you need you need a set of rules which really address that. And that is not a dynamic, it's not a static situation, it's a dynamic process. So fortunately, the Commission is the one which sets these rules, does so in close consultation with member states and stakeholders, but we take that responsibility and we are accountable for it. But the key word here is monitoring, the permanent monitoring of the markets.
Stephanie, what do you?
Yeah, I would like to add, and echoing what Ben has just said regarding the fact, and I agree that state aid is a dynamic approach. I would say also that state aid is not a science, you know, that can be applied without taking into account the reality, as you said, of the market and also the other policies that the European Union is pursuing. I think this is very important, not working as a silo tool, not working as a silo science static tool, but also making sure that it's adapted and fit for other purposes. And I think the temporary frameworks shown that I mean, the response was prompt from the European Commission, and also that this tool has been fit for purposes of either response to COVID crisis or energy crisis.
Yeah, it's a very engaged assessment. Dina, I want to ask you a question that is on the Slido. Ben mentioned the matching aid decision to Northvolt earlier on. The question is, how do you control that aid to Northvolt is not just creating a state aid race, so subsidies race, that ends up increasing the costs for everyone of reaching our climate goals?
The aid to Northvolt is a matching aid, so it is in response to a subsidy race. We cannot deny it. But the question was, how do you control? I think we have two tests, and I mentioned throughout the hour we talked before, where that you can use to limit that and to make this subsidies justified. The first one is the counterfactual, so the aid shouldn't be more than the aid given on the other location. And I very much agree with the Commission that there must be a thorough assessment of the evidence on the counterfactual. So state aid is not a science, but should be based on evidence. If there is sound evidence about the counterfactual, this will limit the amount of aid that Europe should be putting in. And then what I mentioned before, there is another test, the comparison between the benefit that Europe gets from it. And obviously Northvolt is a strategic project for Europe to which we can more or less put a value. If that value is higher than the subsidy that comes out from the comparison with the counterfactual, I think it's only justified. And even if, yes, it is a subsidy race, and we shouldn't shy away to call it like this, but it can be limited by these tests, by these controls.
Ben, is it regrettable perhaps that the Commission or the European Union finds itself in this situation of having to engage in matching aid, and how did the Commission go about the assessments?
I would not make a value judgment of that type, but fact of the matter, and that I think is the most important message to convey, in addition to what you just said, that there's a string of conditions that need to be met, to ensure the proportionality, the necessity. It's always the same thing. The use which has been made of that clause is so far very limited. So you can certainly not claim that this is a major contribution of the European Union to a subsidy race, which probably it won't be able to win anyway. So I think let's put things again in proportion and do not overestimate the negative effects of this clause. I think it's extremely realistic and very legitimate, and it is not opening the floodgates, because indeed, as has just been explained, we have a thorough methodology which we apply, and we don't do this overnight.
Right. Stephanie, there's been obviously a lot of talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the idea that companies would be leaving Europe to benefit from this in the US. I think you called the Northvolt matching aid a paradigm change. Do you think that this is enough, or have you seen evidence or heard from companies that are seriously considering moving to the US to take up subsidies under the IRA?
We concretely, I mean, in reality, we have many European groups, for example, and I know in France, considering moving into the US because it's considered as easier, quicker, less burdensome, and but of course, I mean, it's now up to the EU, as I said, to act as a real power. To show that in addition to the fact that it's more important to invest here in Europe, that we also share the same values, and it's about creating European sovereignty, European champion, as I said, and this leads me to the very beginning of my intervention, you know, when I remember when I was rapporteur of the 2019 European policy report,
competition policy
report, sorry, I couldn't use the word European champions. Instead, with my colleagues, to be able to vote the report at the European Parliament, we choose European leaders. Don't know whether it changed a lot, but I mean, you know, so I could feel these bad words. And now, I mean, we are really talking about industry and setting up the right conditions to make sure that there are no, that we don't leave and we don't lost all these big European champions. So I think that's a major step forward.
Yeah. European leaders to European champions. There's another question on Slido. Adina, perhaps I can come to you, because I think this picks up on the example you gave perhaps of Samsung in the battery factory in Hungary. The question is, shouldn't the EU concentrate industry to strategic regions, as the US does, instead of inefficiently sprinkling money over 27 very different member states?
Well, I think this question goes a bit against the construction of Europe and cohesion, and I would leave my panelists to answer more. I mean, the example of Hungary, I'm not sure if Hungary is a strategic region for batteries. It was just regional aid to enhance the economy of Hungary. It was thought that this factory will bring positive externalities, good things for the economy of Hungary overall, which will help to the cohesion of the European Union. I'm not sure about went away the question. I'm not sure about strategic regions in Europe, if this is desirable. It's yes, and if this would be desirable from the... Of course, investment should be efficient. That's I'm thinking as an economist. So if there are synergies, for example, or yes, you don't want... We all often use the metaphor cathedral in the desert. It's too expensive and useless to do this in the desert. But otherwise, to favor certain regions, I defer to my co-panelists. Yes.
If I could Yeah, I mean,
Of course.
it's a matter of economy, of course, but of cohesion,
Of course.
as you rightly pointed out. I think it's very important to maintain the cohesion of Europe, and we were talking about fragmentation. That's where we are. So I think it's always a question of striking the right balance, you know, between the different goals and making sure that all the policies are well articulated all together.
So I think we have more questions on the Slido. This one is from Lorenzo Fiorilli from Clients Earth, and I think Ben, maybe for this one, I may come to you first. The question is, how do we ensure that aid aimed at industrial policy does not harm the environment? Should there be climate or environmental mainstreaming across state aid rules, which I think means should there also be a kind of parallel assessment of aid's impact on the climate or the environment in the state aid rules? Perhaps there is already to some
I would
degree.
say so, yes. We have a very extensive and elaborated framework, the so-called SEAC, which deals with aid to protect the climate, but also the environment. And that is the last piece of legislation which we have adopted to frame state aid in a long series which goes back to many decades. So there are the rules on the mainstream rules on environment which are provided in the treaty and which also, of course, guide the way we define competition policy. So I don't think there is a tension which in practice poses difficulties. But the fact of the matter, and that is of course typical for state aid control, we do have to balance public policy interests, and we have a certain degree of discretion in doing so on the basis, to the extent we have not limited that discretion through our frameworks. But without that discretion, of course, the balancing act would not be possible. It's as simple as that in that respect. But I do believe that one can never claim on the basis of not only the framework, the regulatory framework applicable to state aid and the state aid decisions which we take, and also our record before the Court of Justice, that in any way climate and environmental interests are in any way neglected by state aid or our state aid control in practice.
Because I remember there was during the COVID crisis there was French aid given to Air France,
yes,
which was approved by the Commission, and I seem to remember that the French government imposed conditions on that went beyond, that imposed certain environmental objectives on the company, such as reducing emissions, but this was something that the Commission was not able to do because in some way the Commission could assess the state aid given but could not impose commitments of that.
No, but that would be that is dangerous, because that would if we were to be able to do so, we would have a kind of abuse of our powers. We of course have the treaty gives us a mandate in relation to state aid policy, state aid control, and we need to stick to that mandate. We cannot proactively pursue other policy interests than those which are explicitly entrusted with the Commission. But for instance, just to give you a concrete example, what we simply cannot do, and that is a very good thing, we could never authorize a state aid, declare it compatible with the internal market, if inextricably linked to it is a government action, a legislation which infringes on environmental law, because that would qualify it as not compatible with the internal market.
Understood.
There it stops.
Stéphanie, briefly, do you find that state aid law ought to do more to promote environmental objectives?
Well, I think we need to carry on discussing this point, and I do remember what you just recalled regarding the fact that somehow during the COVID crisis we had the feeling that some member states could go further than the European Commission, and So, well, I think the more we will get into the Green Deal implementation, I think the more we will have to. It's just, I think, the really beginning of the story. Let's see, as when it comes to state aid and environmental issues.
Yeah.
For me, that's the very beginning. So we will have to discuss again and meet again in this format on this issue.
Very good. Well, Adina, do you have any? Well, I think in that case, we're going to have to wrap up. There are more episodes in the making, and DG Competition will let you know very soon when those episodes are coming out next. To find out about what's coming up, I'd suggest looking at the DG Competition's website or some of the excellent social media accounts it has. You can find them on X or Twitter or LinkedIn. And of course, if you would like to rewatch this particular debate, you'll be able to find it on the website of DG Competition or YouTube. Thank you very much.
Thank you.